without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. But before that, I have to ask them, all the panel members, to join us with the video. Please don't unmute your microphones yet, only when you will be speaking, but we need your camera on, and I'm already seeing perhaps all of you, which is very good news. Let me see. Let me just check Anna Steiner and James Brown and Rosa, Florence, GEOGHEGAN. Yes, and Christian Neubacher. Sorry. Okay, so everybody's here, so we can officially start the panel. So we will have 4 presenters. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming and thanks for joining this panel. The first presenter will be Anna Steiner, University of Graz, and Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Research on Consequences of War, also in Graz, and a PhD candidate. We must mention that she's here for the second time at our conference, so she is a kind of old member of our Cold War conference group, so to say. The next speaker, the title of her presentation will be The Road to Helsinki, Neutral Austria in Soviet Foreign Policy Strategy from 1969 to 1975. Next speaker will be James P. Brown, Northumbria University, United Kingdom, Department of Humanities, PhD candidate. The topic will be Cold War dissidents and their transnational supporters in Britain, America, and the USSR, 1964-1991. The next speaker will be Rosa Florence GEOGHEGAN. I hope the pronunciation will be fine, but if not, please correct me. Columbia University, New York, United States, European Studies, dual BA program. And last but not least, the 4th presenter will be Christian Neubacher, Columbia University, United States, master candidate, European History, Politics and Society master program. Sorry, I forgot to mention the previous topic for Rosa Florence GEOGHEGAN. The topic will be Neutrality, Geography, and Sovereignty, an examination of Cold War neutrality in 3 small European states, Ireland, Austria, and Finland. And finally, the topic for Christian Neubacher will be The Magnificent Magyars, Hungarian-Soviet Relations Through Football Diplomacy. So these are the topics and the presenters. So the floor is Anna's. So Anna, please start your presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here again and happy to open the panel on neutrality. I'm sorry, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, so you will see me instead talking. And as you mentioned, I will talk about the road to Helsinki, Neutral Austria in Soviet Foreign Policy Strategy, 1969 to 1975, so on the road to the Helsinki Accords. As was mentioned in the beginning, the role of neutrality in East-West relations in Europe during the Cold War is relatively little explored. And this is surprising when you consider that within the Cold War era, there was a period on the road to the Helsinki Accords in which neutral states, and among them Austria, used their single-time chance to proactively shape European Cold War politics. During the CSC talks in Helsinki and Geneva, 35 European states, plus the United States and Canada, participated in questions of sovereignty and equal rights and outside of military alliances. And these conditions, together with consensual vote, allowed a relatively strong position for the neutral and non-aligned states. My project aims to shed a light on Soviet diplomacy towards Austria during this crucial phase of East-West détente and CSCE negotiations. With the main goal of fixing the status quo in Europe, the USSR had been pushing for such a conference for years, and starting in 1966, targeted the neutral states as advocates and possible initiators. The pressure on Austria to take the initiative was especially high. Vienna, however, wanted to avoid being used as a propaganda platform by the East, and therefore Austria repeatedly made clear it would support a European Security Conference, but could not take the initiative. The Austrian argument that such a conference would need good and careful preparation was used as a precautionary measure, as the then Austrian Foreign Minister Waldheim called it, since it already implied agreement on the circle of participants. And the Austrians, from the Soviet cautiously accepting reactions to the Austrian argument that the United States should participate in such a conference, Austria already in 1968, by the beginning of 1968, draw the correct conclusion that the Soviets would not oppose the participation of the United States, but wanted to demand the participation of the GDR in return. And in fact, it had been clear to the Soviet side from the outset that the European conference without US participation was unrealistic. But officially, participation had been confirmed by Warsaw Pact states only at the Foreign Ministers' Conference in July 1970. In Austria, the idea as such of a pan-European conference received a lot of attention, as Austria was naturally interested in improving the relations and the situation in its immediate neighborhood and the situation at its borders. From 1965-66, Austria actively discussed the question of a security conference in the so-called Group of 9, later Group of 10, a group formed on initiative of Romania within the UN that would meet occasionally to discuss matters of mutual pan-European interest. These activities and Austria's participations, however, were not welcomed in Moscow. The Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told his Austrian counterpart Waldheim frankly that it was, I quote, not in the spirit of Soviet policy to support the advances of a group of 10, which had appointed itself. In Vienna, it was assumed that Moscow feared that the contacts between NATO states, neutrals, and Eastern states could weaken the connection in the East. And it was thought that Moscow itself was behind the so-called systematic obstruction within the group by Bulgaria and Hungary. In the wake of the crisis in Czechoslovakia, the Group of 10 eventually lost its importance. 1968 was a turning point for several reasons. The suppression of the Prague Spring clouded not only the thought, but also, but only briefly, bilateral relations. But the situation quickly eased, not least due to economic means, because a gas contract between Austria and the Soviet Union was signed in June 1968 and came into force on the 1st of September as planned, and Soviet gas flowed through the Iron Curtain then for the first time. But another reason is that in 1968, a key Soviet bargaining chip fell away. Since 1961, Austria had been seeking an association or agreement with the European Economic Community, and for Moscow, this was absolutely a red line by then. In Moscow's eyes, an association would contradict the prohibition stated in the State Treaty, prohibition of an annexation or Anschluss to Germany. Moscow accused Austria of putting neutrality forward when it came to a pan-European conference, but not taking it seriously when it came to the EEC. And when Italy finally vetoed an arrangement between the EEC and Austria, a Soviet bargaining chip fell away. After the Finnish initiative of the 5th of May 1969, Austrian politicians were punished by the media in Austria for missing the chance of such a conference. Austria from then on constantly made clear to the Soviets that Vienna would be ready to be the host of a later stage if desired. Helsinki was never officially questioned, but it was noted on several occasions that Vienna was better equipped for such a conference. But then tensions between Moscow and Helsinki over the election of the UN Secretary General at the end of 1971, in which the Austrian Foreign Minister Waldheim and not the Finnish candidate won, were not exploited. On the contrary, the new Austrian Foreign Minister Kirchschläger, in view of the strained relations, advocated for Helsinki as the main venue, because he was convinced that, I quote, the advantage for Austria of choosing Vienna would not outweigh the disadvantage of weakening Finland. Vienna as possible location was actually not off the table for a long time. Even in May 1973, during the heated final phase of the preliminary talks in Helsinki, Brezhnev said in conversation with Brandt that the USSR was flexible with regard to the question of holding the actual conference in stages in Helsinki, Geneva, and Vienna. As is well known, Vienna in the end became the venue of the MBFR, the Mutual Balanced Force Reduction talks, talks that Vienna actually would have preferred to see integrated into the CSCE to have a say in them. In keeping with Kreisky's neighborhood policy, the Austrian delegation's interest quickly shifted to the later third basket and the freedom of movement, even though Foreign Minister Kirchschläger personally felt that freedom of movement was rather a case for quiet diplomacy. He said, I quote, "The free movement of people is one of Austria's main goals, but we should not say this. We should therefore not push too hard for this point at the conference." One reason for this was also the imminent entry into force of the free trade agreement between the EEC and Austria in January 1973, which he assumed would bring a cold period for several months in the relations with the Soviet Union. Therefore, he wanted to avoid further upsetting the Soviets at this stage. Even though before the conference, freedom of movement, partly for domestic political reasons, was added to the Austrian conference agenda, Kirchschläger explained to his delegation directly before the preparatory talks that he did not want to be a pioneer in the subject of freedom of movement. Nevertheless, the Austrian delegation found its main field of activity above all in this point. The Austrian draft for the preamble of the third basket, which the Austrian delegation prepared, is regarded, as Günter Bischoff put it, the star hour of post-war Viennese diplomacy. With regard to the long and far-reaching preliminary talks in Helsinki, Brezhnev at the plenary session in April 1973 suggested that the relations with the middle and smaller countries of Europe, of capitalist Europe, should be more strongly activated, since these are, I quote, one of the not yet fully exploited reserves. In July 1973, Soviet Premier Kosygin visited Austria. And in a central intelligence bulletin, it was concluded that the visit was part of an orchestrated Soviet effort to improve bilateral relations with the neutral states. Indeed, the cold period after the conclusion of the free trade agreement with the EEC was over. In the communiqué, the Soviets for the first time included a reference to the constitutionally anchored Austrian neutrality. And the Soviets also indicated they would pose no further objections to Vienna's contacts with the EEC. In fact, association with the EEC did not harm relations. including economic relations between Austria and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Bilateral trade continued to grow, and in 1975, trade with Eastern Europe accounted for more than 15% of Austria's total foreign trade. While Austria was not successful with its specific proposals, such as Chancellor Kreisky's personal favorite subject, the Middle East crisis, but this was not supported by any other country, and aware of this, neither the foreign ministry nor the delegation seriously pushed it. Or the inclusion of the MBFR within the CC, Austria was able to achieve the broader goal of making its mark as a mediator between East and West in the negotiations. And in any case, the Austrian delegation left its personal signature in the final act, since most of the texts on human contacts were written by Austrian authors. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna, for this very interesting survey of Austria's contribution to the whole Helsinki process. And it was, of course, in a nutshell, but we know that your research will be exploring it in much more detail. So it was very nice to see, and this was very indicative how a small country on the Western side, having very special relations with the Eastern Bloc, just like Austria had a very special position also in the whole process leading up to the Helsinki process. Let us move to the next presenter. So the floor is now yours, James P. Brown. James, please.
Hello, thank you. Just give me a second to share the PowerPoint.
Yes. Okay, we can see that.
You can see that, can't you? Okay. So this presentation is based on my PhD project, which focuses on Cold War dissidents and the support they received transnationally throughout the entirety of the Cold War. So the project arose out of my interest in Soviet dissidents and their reception in the West, which there is a growing field of literature on, some of which I'll cover in this presentation. I was looking initially at the ways dissidents were appropriated in the West in the name of a wide variety of different political causes, particularly in the 1970s and the 1980s. Most of all, I began looking at how Western conservatives, most of all in Britain and America, engaged with the Soviet dissidents and used them as evidence of the bankruptcy of communism to support their anti-communist political agendas. I looked at the ways in which dissidents were presented by these conservatives and in some cases liberal political figures as evidence of the universality of Western political values, as well as using the dissidents as a weapon to attack the Soviet Union's human rights record. As I said, though, this is a growing field and there is now a substantial amount of literature focusing on this topic. And so as I engaged with it more, I began to wonder whether the Soviet Union had engaged in a similar process of, identifying and appropriating what it would call Western dissidents, left-wing dissidents in the West, members of the Communist Party, other types of communists. I began to wonder, did the Soviet Union do something similar? And there is a literature on this, but it is very small. It sort of appeared in two bursts. The first burst was a short one in the 1970s, which looked at the relationship primarily between the Soviet Union and the New Left. And that's fairly interesting. However, it's not until recently in the sort of 2010s and now in the 2020s that this topic has begun to receive any serious attention. And scholars studying this topic do now agree that, like Soviet dissidents were very well received in the West, so too were members of the New Left and other radical left groups. So too were they well received in the USSR and exploited by the Soviet state for foreign policy and ideological purposes. Most of all, I've been looking at the concept of dissidentism. So here I've just got a profile of, the Soviet dissidents. They were the opponents of the Soviet government, or at least critics of it. And they were, of course, persecuted by the state, including the misuse of psychiatry and prescription drugs. And they were celebrated as heroes in the West. And pictured is one of the most famous, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Dissidentism is a category developed by Kasper Schulecki, who's written a monograph in 2019 on dissidents in Central Europe during the Cold War, although it does address Soviet dissidents too. And this is an analytical category used to describe the relationship dissidents had to Western journalism and Western politics. This is the celebration of dissidents by Western journalism and Western politics. And it is used to identify the fact that the way in which dissidents were portrayed in the West is very different to how dissidents actually were in reality. They were, often presented as, people with Western-style political programs, when in actual fact dissidents had a diverse range of political ideas about how to reform the Soviet Union. But in Western journalism and politics, that really was oversimplified and used to support domestic political agendas in Western countries. Most of all, the dissidents were collectively, regardless of whether they were someone like Solzhenitsyn with very right-wing views, or they were someone more independent, like Andrei Amalrik or Andrei Sakharov. Regardless of what their views were, they were interpreted as the evidence of the sort of the universality of Western democratic values and Western-style civilization. And so dissidentism specifically refers to that process of where the dissidents were sort of created as images in Western newspapers and radio shows and TV shows as these sort of vehicles for anti-communism, when in actual fact many of them still remain communists or socialists and had very different views. Of course, this benefited dissidents. It drew attention to their cause, but it did misrepresent their views. Dissidentism, this category, is based on these three criteria that you can see pictured here. And they are open, legal, non-violent action under a oppressive sanction. So that's dissidents, dissident activity. The second point is Western attention. And the third is domestic recognition. However, as I said, I began to wonder, does evidence exist of the Soviet Union doing something similar? And the scholarship so far indicates that they did. No one has yet, though, addressed the question of whether dissidentism, which is quite an important development in the field of studying Cold War dissent, no one has asked whether dissidentism is also applicable to the relationship between the Soviet Union and the so-called Western dissidents. And the basis of my PhD project is to argue that yes, it was applicable, that this analytical category of dissidentism is applicable to the relationship between the New Left and the Soviet Union, as well as between other radical left elements in the West and the Soviet Union. And then in the following slides, I will explain how I make that case in a few case studies. The first case study is the New Left. So the wave and groupuscules of political activism in the West, mostly active during the 1960s and 1970s. Their activism coalesced around anti-racism, opposition to the Vietnam War, and anti-capitalism. They were, of course, often not big fans of the Soviet Union, which is notable to remember. The New Left were also persecuted by domestic security services, especially the FBI in the US. There's a book by someone called Cunningham, which is very worth looking at, that looks at the FBI's use of COINTELPRO to suppress the New Left. The New Left did also receive support from the Soviet press and government, which we can get into more later. So the research question in this case study is, were the New Left dissidents, and was there dissidentism between them and the Soviet Union? The other example I'm looking at are trade unions and the extent to which they were presented as dissidents in the Soviet press and Soviet media for domestic consumption. I've listed a couple of examples there. The air traffic controllers strike in the US in 1981 and the British miners' strike in 1984-85. These were heavily covered in Soviet newspaper and radio broadcasts, and were a very important topic for a long time in Soviet propaganda. Thus, the research question is, were the miners dissidents? I'm focusing on the miners to begin with. And was there dissidentism between them and the Soviet Union? The specific case study for the New Left is the Angela Davis trial of 1970 to 1972, which has also got a small literature focusing on it. And then the British miners' strike, as I already mentioned. The purpose of looking at these is to address whether the USSR also used dissidents to argue its value system was universal. Were the New Left and the strikes, were they evidence of Marxism's universal applicability in the eyes of Soviet leaders and Soviet editors in newspapers? It also connects to another topic, and that's one that's been addressed by Meredith Roman most of all, and that is interrogating sort of this myth of the US's Cold War innocence. US leaders claimed that political prisoners couldn't exist in the West as it was democratically superior. But they also made the argument that Soviet leaders were uniquely sensitive to criticism of the human rights record, whereas the US was far more open-minded. Regardless of this, though, the CIA monitored Soviet support for Western dissidents like Angela Davis and considered it subversion. And so in this way, we can look at how dissidents were sort of contested across East and West during the Cold War. So the first case study, and that's the Angela Davis trial of 1970-1972. Angela Davis was a figure of the New Left, a member of the Black Power movement. She was also a professor, and she is a good example of the type of Soviet interest that arose around people in the New Left. And as I said, Meredith Roman is the principal scholar on this topic at the moment. And Angela Davis ended up being put on trial after she had been sacked at UCLA for refusing to renounce her membership of the Communist Party. She was then put on trial for charges of murder and kidnapping which she was ultimately not guilty of at all. And so in terms of addressing the criteria for dissidentism, the first criteria of there being open legal action, non-violent in nature and under a repressive sanction, Davis meets all of these criteria. She was persecuted by the US state for her political beliefs. She was forced out of her position as a professor at UCLA because she remained a member of the Communist Party, and was not a violent activist, even though she was accused of this. She was, people tried to sort of assassinate, the press tried to assassinate her character, essentially. And she was also targeted by the FBI's COINTELPRO program, aimed at suppressing radicals. On the second category, which is Western attention, and here I ask, well, what if you replace this with Soviet attention? Because the existing scholarship argues that there is no possibility of Soviet dissidentism. Yet, I think if you change this one category, you begin to appreciate that there was a huge amount of interest in Angela Davis's trial in the USSR. It obviously had an ulterior motive, but that's the point of this category as well. It recognizes that there's always an ulterior motive behind any state party's interest in dissidents in a rival's camp, so to speak. So Davis received huge support from the USSR's press and government. Books, articles in papers were published to support her cause, and she eventually visited the USSR following her trial. The Soviet media depicted her as a political prisoner. However, it is important to note she didn't necessarily share the views of the Soviet leadership and Soviet communism. Her family's receipt of support was a sort of tactical decision. They decided to exploit the Cold War tensions to attract maximum attention to save Davis during her trial. Again, though, this does support the idea of dissidentism, because the point is that while Davis may have had very different views to the Soviet leadership, they still invested in building an image of her that advanced sort of the cause of Soviet communism and showed essentially the problems in the USA and the flaws with capitalism and Western democracy, and used her image to support Soviet communism. This is just a small chart to show the extent to which she featured in Soviet news during her trial. So the y-axis is the percentage of Soviet propaganda and news reports devoted to Angela Davis's trial, plotted against some key issues in Soviet foreign policy at this time. This is using data collated by the CIA, which closely monitored the Soviet coverage of Angela Davis's trial, as it did Soviet coverage of other sensitive issues, and they produced statistical reports on the proportion to which topics received attention in Soviet media. And essentially the graph is just to show that her trial remained as important as key topics such as events in the Middle East and China. It received around 4% of her case featured in around 4% of all news reports around late 1970, and continued to remain an important theme in Soviet propaganda into the new year of 1971. Finally, get to the third criteria for dissidentism, and that's domestic recognition, which Davis also had. In the US, there were hundreds of defense councils established to support Davis, and she had significant support from the radical press. The conclusion I draw, therefore, based on that evidence, is that dissidentism is a useful analytical category in this place, and it did take place between Angela Davis during her trial and the Soviet Union, and I've just sort of done a checklist there. Again, as I said, this also connects to exposing, this narrative of that the US used regarding dissidents in the Soviet Union and human rights, that it was innocent. It exposes that narrative as the myth. This, as I said, the CIA were very, very concerned by the USSR's coverage of her trial in the USA. They called it subversion, aggression, and manipulation. The reports, which were featured in the Soviet press on her trial, which is similar to the language used by KGB reports when they're discussing Western attention and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. They also call it ideological subversion, and the CIA also call Soviet interest in Angela Davis subversion. The second case study is the British miners' strike. So very different to Angela Davis's. This is more about trade unions and labour action. Nonetheless, it was a very, very important topic in Soviet press for the duration of the strike. And again, I've followed the method of assessing it along the lines of the criteria for dissidentism. So the miners' strike began in 1984 in response to the incumbent Conservative government's plans to shut down huge numbers of mines and make redundant thousands of miners. There's a long history of confrontation between miners and British Conservative governments in the United Kingdom, and this was it was the most significant clash and the last great clash between trade unions and a British government in the 20th century, and there has not yet been one on a similar scale in the 21st century. The miners were very, very militantly organized. They had a openly communist leader in a man called Arthur Scargill, who was the key trade union leader in the 1980s and the 1970s. And they went on strike in numbers of hundreds of thousands, and their aim was to sort of bring the energy supplies of the country by refusing to mine coal to a standstill to force the government to backtrack on its plan to make them redundant.
I'm sorry, you have five more minutes to finish. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the miners' strike, in terms of the criteria for dissidentism, was legal. Most scholars on this agree it was legal, even though it contravened legislation. But this was very politically motivated and recently introduced to try and stop the miners going on strike. And a man called Seamus Milne has exposed the extent to which the Domestic Security Service in Britain, the MI5, the police, government and press all colluded to suppress the miners' strike by smearing them in the press, but also in some cases, using violence, provoking violence, and trying to discredit the miners whatever way they could, and also simply arresting them. Western attention, again, what if we replace this with Soviet attention? Well, there was huge interest in the Soviet press, in the miners' strike, and eventually, covertly, financial support was offered to the miners through Soviet channels. And on Soviet radio reports and the press, the miners appear as anti-capitalist dissidents, and they confirm the Marxist worldview that Marxist materialism is universally applicable. And the third category, domestic recognition. The miners did receive domestic recognition, essentially. They had support from left-wing politics and press in Britain, and some recognition from the opposition Parliamentary Labour Party. And so I therefore draw the conclusion with this little checklist again. There was dissidentism between the British miners during their strike of 1984-85 and the Soviet Union. Significance of looking at these issues. In one sense, this makes us, forces us to look at Cold War history no longer from a Western-centric view. We recognize that there were some similarities between the USSR and the West in terms of how they engaged with these dissidents. The Soviet Union had its own form of modernity, which it saw as superior and proved to be universal in the appearance of what it saw as anti-capitalist dissidents in the West, just as Western politicians saw proof of the universality of liberal democracy in Soviet dissidents. There is an understudied history, although, as I've said, it's beginning to receive attention finally, but it remains understudied on the Soviet engagement with left-wing dissenters in the West. And hopefully more people will begin to interrogate the relationship between dissidents and the supporters abroad, revealing the ulterior motives behind support for dissidents in many cases. And it's equally relevant with contemporary dissidents in modern day Russia or even Belarus, where, at least in Britain, in the press I read, the coverage of people like Navalny is being manipulated for political purposes in Britain to serve the agendas of the domestic political parties, Conservative, Labour, and otherwise. So on that basis, I would say this has significance. And that brings it to an end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting and fascinating analysis and account of this topic, which is, as you say, and I'm absolutely sure it is true, rather unexplored. And that's something which again brings me to encouraging you to go further with this project. And this is something which again is a very marketable project. Well, maybe it's not the best word to use in an academic context, but we are humans and everybody lives from the market, as we say. So it's very important whether a topic is just interesting for a bunch of other scholars, because it's important for them, or it would interest a much wider audience and society and people at large. And this is exactly such a topic, definitely. So this is a very unexplored or understudied part of Soviet behavior, so to say, activity during the Cold War. Everybody knows about it in general terms. Yes, the Soviet Union was supporting everybody. Well, this was a big mistake, as we can see, because eventually they collapsed, and supporting everybody was just not what a poor country actually should have done if they had been more clever. Because, well, we are talking about not, of course, just this part of the support, but the real one. I mean, the arms race and supporting all the liberation movements all around the world with a much bigger budget, which was the big chunk of the wasted money, so to say, on the Soviet side. But Western support given to different kind of actors in Western societies was definitely a big part of that wasted budget too. As far as I know, I'm not an expert on this topic, but as far as I know, there are not really available calculations or even estimates about this part of the budget. Whatever has been given to Cuba, we have some numbers, let's say, in the literature, in documents. but not about this one. And because it's really divided among hundreds of targets and countries and the organizations and parties and everything else. So I never heard of any kind of estimate to sum it up. Okay, how much was this, per year for the Soviet Union? And I'm sure this was a lot also. Because they took it seriously. They wanted to reach out and they wanted to have an impact. And this was a fascinating case study and a presentation about how they were trying to do this. Just one anecdotal comment is that, of course, I remember from my childhood, Free Angela Davis. Free Angela Davis was a slogan you could hear everywhere, on TV, radio, in the press, in the Soviet bloc countries. So it's not just, of course, the Soviet Union itself, but all the Soviet bloc countries actually had the same similar attitude to this. So it was almost as important a propaganda topic, just like the Vietnam War, like hands-off Vietnam was the one topic. Free Angela Davis was the other one in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So again, thank you very much for that. And then with that, let's move to the next presenter because we are behind schedule. So the floor is yours, Rosa. So please go ahead and have your presentation.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen.
Sure.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, now we can see this. Now.
Okay.
Neutrality, geography, and sovereignty. Yes,
that's correct.
Good.
Neutrality, geography, and sovereignty. An examination of Cold War neutrality in 3 small European nations, Ireland, Austria, and Finland. Ireland, Austria, and Finland are all small nations with populations of under 10 million people. Perhaps due to this, these 3 nations remained neutral throughout the Cold War. While Ireland had adopted a policy of neutrality before World War II, Austria and Finland chose neutral foreign policies in the aftermath of the violence. Not only was neutrality a foreign and security policy, but it also served to assert sovereignty. For Ireland, Austria, and Finland, neutrality was a clear way to underline their rejection of their occupiers and colonizers. These countries ratified this policy of neutrality despite the distaste it left in the mouths of many other global leaders at the time. Many considerable political figures, like US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, declared neutrality to be immoral, as it highlighted the indifference of these nations to the suffering of others. Similarly, the New York Times published in June 1956 that President Eisenhower firmly believed in the increased security of alliances with the US, as opposed to remaining neutral. As a result of these policies of neutrality, none of these countries joined NATO or sought to enter the Cold War on either side. However, it is significant that these 3 nations, Ireland, Austria, and Finland, are in strategic locations across Europe, ideally located in between, and in the case of Finland, right beside, the Cold War superpowers, the USA and the USSR. Ireland is on the periphery of Western Europe, the last stop before the 6,000-kilometre journey to the USA. In theory, Ireland had been neutral since 1939, the beginning of World War II. However, in reality, Ireland's foreign policy during World War II was friendly neutrality, meaning that weather reports that facilitated attacks like the D-Day landing were passed on to the Allied forces. Furthermore, while internment camps in Ireland were open for Axis power personnel, British or American soldiers were allowed to relieve and return to active service. For Irish politicians, notably Irish Taoiseach Eamon de Valera, the adoption of a policy of neutrality was an assertion of Irish independence. By choosing a different foreign policy to the United Kingdom, especially during World War II, the Irish state was underlining their newfound sovereignty. This was in sharp contrast to the other former British colonies, who fought on the Allied side at the request of Winston Churchill. In the aftermath of the war, De Valera defended Irish neutrality against the disparaging comments made about it by Churchill. Understandably, however, this policy put more strain on the already tense Anglo-Irish relationship. CIA documents from 1949 note Ireland's important geographical position in between the United States and their ally, the United Kingdom. Indeed, these documents describe how the denial of Ireland to an enemy is an inescapable principle of United States security. In the wrong hands, Ireland's strategic location would allow for the interference with lines of communication between Europe and the US, and might permit the establishment of enemy sea and air bases. Submarines from naval bases would be able to occupy much of the eastern Atlantic Ocean, while the air bases would have a notable range from the Ural Mountains to North America. Following the end of World War II, Irish foreign policy was characterised by a number of traits that stemmed from their geographical location and cultural similarities. First, while Ireland was, and still remains, geographically and economically close to Britain, there was a move to consolidate Irish independence. Secondly, due to cultural and especially religious similarities, Ireland was connected to Western Europe. Finally, Ireland sought to enhance the links between themselves and the United States that had been established through over a century of emigration. Indeed, documents from the US note Ireland's occasionally over-optimistic belief in the benevolence of the USA. As such, while Ireland had indeed adopted a policy of neutrality, it was a form of neutrality that was closely aligned with the ideologically and culturally close Western Bloc. At the beginning of the Cold War, intelligence agents in the USA reflected on Ireland's possible move away from neutrality in the event of a war between the superpowers because of the cultural, economic, and ideological similarities between Ireland, the US, and Western Europe. Austria is in the very centre of Europe, on the axis of East and West. Its foreign policy was dictated by this precarious position, sandwiched between the Eastern and Western blocs. But there was nonetheless the suggestion by Austrian chancellors of utilising Austria as a bridge between the blocs. Its location along the Iron Curtain was of significance to both the US and the USSR. Andreas Rendo writes that in contemporary Europe, many countries are unaware of the extent of Austria's impact on the Cold War. It functioned as a grey area between the two superpowers, a nation that aimed to positively influence negotiations. Despite the December 1943 issue of the Voice of Austria characterising neutrality as dishonourable, Austria nonetheless constitutionally declared its neutrality in 1955 in order to end the occupation by the superpowers. This agreement was twofold. For the Eastern Bloc, it was imperative that Austrians maintain their neutrality by not joining NATO or allowing foreign military bases to be established in Austria. For the Western Bloc, Austrian occupation ended because Austria committed itself to neutrality and, most importantly, democracy. As such, neutrality was a key component of post-war Austrian independence, although in comparison to Ireland, it was a decision that was thrust upon them. Documents from the United States highlight Austria's desire to closely align itself with the Western Bloc, and many of Austria's political decisions during the Cold War were reactions to growing or waning Soviet power. However, while Austria was culturally and economically similar to the Western Bloc, this did not preclude Austrian officials and diplomats from establishing close relationships with their Soviet counterparts. Austria's affinity with both blocs was an important factor to watch for both superpowers, as Austrian neutrality was young, meaning that it was receptive to outside influences. In comparison to its neighbour Switzerland, Austria was very inexperienced with neutrality. The CIA characterised Austrian neutrality as a balancing act, although, like Ireland, they believed that in the event of another world war, Austria would take the side of the ideologically similar bloc. For example, US intelligence officers note that Austria would be unlikely to accept any substantial aid from the USSR if the US government were to oppose it. Finnish neutrality during the Cold War is very interesting for a number of reasons, the most important being its profound historic, cultural, and economic links to its powerful neighbour, the USSR. As recently as 1917, Finnish independence was recognised by the Bolshevik government, having been a Grand Duchy of Russia before. Declaring its neutrality in 1956, Finland joined, like Ireland and Austria, the cohort of small European states whose foreign and security policies allowed them to hover between the two superpowers. Finland's Cold War neutrality, a reasonably precarious policy, was intent on keeping Finland on the western side of the Iron Curtain. While Ireland did not share a border with either of the superpowers, and Austria shared a border with many Soviet satellite states, Finland and the USSR were direct neighbours. Indeed, Finland shares a 1,340-kilometre border with the USSR, which in contemporary times is one of the most sophisticated in Europe. For reference, the Finnish-Russian border is 200 kilometres longer than the distance from Budapest to Amsterdam. Finnish political scientists note that President Urho Kekkonen was largely responsible for not only implementing this policy, but also for drumming up wide support for it, internationally as well as nationally. The principal aim of the policy was to give Finland more room to manoeuvre without offending or cutting off the Eastern Bloc. CIA documents note that the pressure on Finland, obvious to both the Finns themselves and external observers, stemmed from the Finnish reliance on the Soviet bloc for trade, as exports to other European nations had dwindled at the beginning of World War II. A Radio Free article from 1967, the 50-year anniversary of Finnish independence, reflects on the fatal geography of Finland during the Cold War. The description of the half-century of independence as a fight for survival speaks to the enormous strain on the Finnish people, as they sought to not be reduced to the status of a Moscow satellite. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting account of these three European small states as neutrals in the Cold War divide. We'll come back to this in the Q&A section again, as we have already mentioned several times. This is a very important and new trend of study and research, and especially in comparison. That's something which you were focusing on, because of course most such research is first of all focusing on a certain country, because that's how you have to start it, and then you can start comparing those countries' policies. And on the now available literature, you have done a great job to bring them together and to make comparisons between these countries, and especially the case of Ireland is significant and remarkable here, because Ireland is mostly left out of this comparison, or almost forgotten when we are talking about the role of neutrals in the Cold War, because Ireland is more or less regarded to be a neutral, yes, but basically a kind of ally of the United Kingdom, as you also mentioned, this kind of CIA perception in your presentation. So, but still, it still was a neutral country, and in that sense, it's really worth exploring and examining what kind of policies they were pursuing as a neutral country during the Cold War period. So with that, let's move on and give the floor to the last presenter in this panel, Christian Neubacher, also from Columbia University. Now the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen as well.
Sure. Just take your time.
Sorry, one moment.
Okay.
Can you see my slide?
Yes, just a second. Let me see. I have to come back to this. I see myself.
Wait, can you see my slide now? Sorry.
Let me see. And I'm also frozen on the picture, what I can see right now. So, are you here?
Yeah.
Yes, please talk so that I can see that you are here, which is true and good.
But,
However,
so you can see the slide.
But I don't see any slide. Please, Dora and Simon, please let me know by the chat whether this is the same video.
Try one thing. Otherwise, I will. Otherwise, I will just present without my PowerPoint. I don't know why it's not working.
That's absolutely a possibility. So don't worry. Just take your time. If you can fix it, that's fine. We'll wait for that. And
yeah, I don't know why it's not working. So I apologize, but I will just present without my slide. I hope that will be okay. I had two pictures which I'd hoped to show, but hopefully I'll be able to convey the what I've been trying to say just through my words instead. So my name is Christian Neubacher. I'm presenting on the Magnificent Magyars, which was one of the many nicknames provided to the golden team of Hungarian football, which was from about the late 1940s through to about the early 1960s. And this team was not only dominant in Europe, but really one of the greatest teams in the world during this era, and serves as an interesting case study, both of in football history and in the development of the sport as a team and through its organization and through its tactics and so forth, and also as an important instrument within the broader Hungarian-Soviet relationship and Hungarian relationship with its neighbors in Eastern and in Western Europe. And I hope to provide some further information on that today. Specifically, I am arguing that the 56 revolution and the changes which occurred afterward altered communist perceptions of the role of football in Hungary. Prior to the revolution, football was viewed as a top-down instrument, both to exert national identity and strength against the Western Bloc, and as well as a method of expression, of controlled expression domestically. After the 1956 revolution, football becomes less top-down and more cooperative, especially as a result of the large levels of emigration from Hungary of some of the most prominent football players, which I will return to later on. These shifts, combined with other long-term trends and the general catch-up of European football from other countries, lead to long-term reductions in investment into the domestic game in Hungary and help bring to an end the era of the Magnificent Magyars. I had a picture of the Hungarian team in 1954, and I'd like to pause on that year for a moment and think about just situate the team and why this is important. In 1954, the Hungarian national football team had gone 4 years without losing a game, a feat which is impressive both in contemporary terms and at the time. Between 1950 and 1954, they did not lose a single game. They ultimately ended up losing the World Cup final in 1954 to West Germany. This was an important moment both for West Germany and for Hungary. In Hungary, this led to significant protests, and some scholars have even suggested that this was sort of a precursor, if you will, to some of the trends which would ultimately bubble up in 1956. For the West Germans, this was the first moment of affirming a post-war German identity. And so that defeat, in addition to ending this 4 years of unbeaten success, also had a significant impact on Hungarian and German. In addition to this unbeaten run, Hungary won gold at the 1952 Olympic Games. They also finished second in the 1938 World Cup, and they would continue their Olympic success in the 1960s, winning gold in 64 and in 68, and also winning silver in 1972, although by this point their World Cup record had declined significantly. And this can be attributed to the discrepancy between the East and the West and how they characterized amateur versus professional players. Of course, the Olympic Games only permit amateur players, and in Eastern Europe, even though most of the players were de facto professional players, they had nominal jobs but did not have to actually do the job. This led to a bit of a discrepancy, but nonetheless, despite this, the achievements of the Hungarian national team through to the 1960s was incredibly impressive and is worth noting in its own right. During this time, during this 4-year unbeaten period, there's another important game of note as well, which was, and what is still dubbed, the match of the century, when Hungary defeated England 6-3 in London in 1953. This was the first time in the history of the game leading up to this point that the English national team had been defeated by another non-British team in the United Kingdom. In their home soil. And so this was a very profound moment. And this was really an important propaganda moment for the Hungarian regime, because this contrasted the very progressive, if you will, playing style of the Hungarian national team, which used very similar tactics, which would resurface in the Netherlands in the 1970s and is even seen today by teams like Barcelona and so forth, contrasting with a much more, what was viewed as a much more rigid and British or an English style of play. And this contrast was both seen on the pitch and was used as such as a propaganda tool off the pitch as well. And so very important in that sense. There were many important players on this team, and the most important of them all was Ferenc Puskás, who today has a FIFA award named after him, and most prolific and successful of the Hungarian players of this time period. And I'll return to him in a little bit when I touch on the question of emigration. So before 1956, how was football governed and structured in Hungary? The origins of the Hungarian footballing success that I've detailed thus far can be found in the interwar period, where there were significant investments into the game in Hungary by the regime at the time. And Hungary in the interwar period was a very important actor in the development of the European game, being one of the most important actors in creating international competitions, especially in the 1920s. In 1949, the Hungarian footballing structure was restructured along Soviet lines, following a similar pattern that was seen both in the Soviet Union and in other Eastern Bloc countries. The most famous sort of example of this being the similar team names: Dynamo Moscow, Dynamo Zagreb, Dynamo Dresden, just to name an example. And each of these teams corresponded with one component of the regime. And so one component tied to the police, one component tied to the army, and so forth. And in Hungary, the team that was connected to the army was Honved, Budapest Honved. And as a result of this, they received the most resources from the regime, both through financial resources and as well as political capital. And as a result, they become both the most successful Hungarian team in the early 1950s and become a sort of de facto second national team during this time. Leading up to 1956, Honved club teams, along with the Hungarian national team, increasingly played international matches abroad, including against non-Warsaw Pact teams. For instance, in my research, I found many reports detailing Honved's travels to Turkey and to other Western-aligned countries. Hungarian and Czech teams were also the first teams to be invited to the USSR after 1946. Before that, the USSR, in footballing terms, had been very isolationist. many examples of especially Hungarian teams traveling to Austria, which became the most frequent destination for Hungarian football teams to go play. You see titles such as, I noted this one because it's quite stark, but you see titles such as Hungarian soccer team invades Vienna. That type of news bulletin was seen quite frequently in my research of the Radio Free Europe archives. So why is this important? Why football? How do we situate this within this broader context? Ferenc Munich, the interior minister right before the Hungarian uprising, at a meeting at the communist in November or December of 1956, I forget the exact date, he stated that soccer and radio broadcasts were the source of anti-Soviet sentiments when the Communist Party was discussing the Hungarian uprising. This is very notable. He was referring to anti-Soviet chants from the fans and crowds during Hungarian and Soviet football games, and also now sentiments that were expressed in these venues. And this demonstrates that football, more so than other sports given its popularity, presented a unique challenge to Soviet and communist control by two mechanisms. First, it provided an outlet for travel for the players, and second, it provided an outlet of expression, especially for the fans, as Munich's comment captured. In my research, I found many reports within these reports, especially by Radio Free Europe, detailing how the Hungarian players would go to, for instance, to Austria, and they would comment on the cheaper and more plentiful goods. And in one of these examples, they noted in a bit of a fascinating way how after the players had been discussing amongst themselves about these cheaper and more plentiful goods, as the trainer comes up and approaches them, they quickly change tact and they say, but actually the prices in Budapest, they're much lower. The prices in Budapest are much better. So, but provided this opportunity for seeing a different side of the world, and as a result wasn't a unique challenge. So how does this 1956 moment affect Hungarian football, and how can we think of this? There's really three different effects that occur. The first is the emigration and exile of football players, and here we see a notable difference between the pre-1956 and the post-1956. Pre-1956, the Hungarian regime had been willing to take quite strong methods and strong tactics to keep players from emigrating. Most notably, in 1951, Sándor Szűcs was executed. He was a member of the team that was tied to the police. He tried to emigrate, and he was executed after he was caught, partially to send a message to the other players to not emigrate. In contrast, in 1956, Ferenc Puskás, the talisman of this Hungarian team, decides to emigrate. He emigrates to Spain. He plays for Real Madrid. He, in fact, becomes a Spanish citizen and even plays for Spain in the 1966 World Cup. And he is, of course, not subject to the same condition. And the Hungarian regime realizes that instead of using these very heavy tactics, they need to be much more cooperative in their engagement with players and make an argument for staying in Hungary. Sorry, I need to take a sip of water, sorry.
Sure, no problem.
Apologies, I'm in the United States, so it's a bit early in the morning still. So in addition to this difference in the perception of the emigration of players, there's also a change in the management from being very top down to being much more cooperative. And as I mentioned, in the case of Puskás and in other players who emigrated, the Hungarian regime after 1956 makes many efforts to try to convince players to come back, to make an argument that you will have better pay, better conditions here to play, and more opportunities for sporting success. And this is a very notable change from the pre-1956 moment. And as a result of that, Hungarian football actually becomes more stable in a way after 1956. But as a result of this also, it has less political capital for the regime, and there leads to less investments into footballing institutions over time. And so this really demonstrates the contrast and the importance of the 1956 moment for Hungarian football. Before 1956, very top-down. After 1956, more cooperative, less investment. And this helps us situate this team both within the context of the Cold War, within the context of footballing history, and I think provides some opportunities for determining further research. And I'd be interested in hearing your suggestions on that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation on Hungarian football in a Cold War context. And of course, this is a great topic. And for Hungarian people, this is something really very dear, like a topic, and they could talk about this for hours in the pubs and everywhere. And everybody knows everything about football, and everybody knows how to do this. But especially, everybody is very proud of the Golden Team, as you mentioned. So absolutely, this is a very interesting topic in that sense. So with that, let's just finish the presentations and then open the floor for discussion. So I am asking the panelists to come back so that we can see all the 4 panel members, and then I'm asking the audience to ask your questions and make your comments. So with the same method, please raise your hand in the Teams, which is available on the top, just besides the 3 dots, and then you can choose the raise function. But if there is nobody, then of course the panelists can also ask questions from each other, and that's something which we haven't done. So, but I'm asking, let's say, Anna, whether you have any reflections on Rosa's presentation about the Austrian part of her speech and talk, because you are talking about very similar things. She is talking about more countries as well, 2 more countries, but Austria was one of the important elements of the analysis. So do you agree with that kind of presentation and of Austria's role in general terms? Of course, that was a general picture. It was not such a differentiated in detail analysis as Soviet policies vis-a-vis Austria and so on. But in general terms, would you add anything to this?
I think in general it was a good overview on the 3 countries. Concerning Austria, I would recommend you at first the book that Mark Kramer mentioned yesterday, and on all the neutral countries, on the neutrals in the Cold War period. And I would also suggest you to look a bit deeper into the negotiations leading to the space treaty, because even in Austria it was not a consensus that neutrality would be the way to go. So that was really a debate that was active for quite some time, and also the Soviet perspective on the topic changed, and Khrushchev then was ready to go for neutrality. So it was his brainchild. It was his also means to show a peaceful his strategy of peaceful cooperation to the world. But it was debated in Austria, and in the end, Austria accepted neutrality and stated neutrality on their own. So you said it correctly that it was an Austrian decision, but it was agreed upon in Moscow. So in Moscow there was the negotiations leading to the state treaty, and it was agreed there, and it was a precondition that Austria would later on their side declare neutrality. So this would be my comment on that.
Thank you. I'll definitely look into that book and the negotiations that you mentioned.
And maybe also there is a book from it's Sturz and Müller, A Cold War over Austria. that also summarize it. It's very good in English. Of course, there are many books in German that I could recommend, but Sturz and Müller have a really good summary. Okay.
I see there is one hand.
Hi, yes, I had a question for Mr. Major regarding your Dissidents project. First of all, very fascinating topic, very interesting. Before I undertook my PhD work, actually, part of my job was tracking American domestic terrorists, both from the right and the left. Left being far more prominent than most people give them credit for, although not particularly dangerous these days. My question is regarding comparing Angela Davis and British trade unionists. I think this might be considered somewhat of a critique, not a criticism though. It's a very great project, but I wonder if your data is somewhat corrupted by the fact that Angela Davis being a woman of color or African-American woman, there's a long history in the United States of violent persecution of people of African-American heritage, and the arrival of communism on the scene led to kind of a conflation of the historic white supremacists. You know, I don't know how to put it in a not nice term, but this paranoid fantasy they have of the kind of African-American uprising that would overthrow their system. Also, the American particular just revulsion or disgust with anything affiliated with communism. As you noted in your presentation, a British trade unionist leader could openly be a communist, and though on the kind of fringe or on the fringe of the political spectrum, that was still acceptable, whereas the United States, most active dissident groups such as the NAACP specifically renounce and reject communism in their charter in order to be credible. And yes. So I wonder if this somewhat corrupts your point of comparison, or if you think there's enough overlap and similarity. Yes, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your question. Yeah, no, it's a good point to raise. I think my intention so far, I haven't fully formulated how we go about structuring it. I think my plan is not so much to compare these two case studies, more just to showcase the wide range of groups that the Soviet Union sought to reach out to. And I think the way I've so far gone about exploring the particular Angela Davis trial, that case study, is to first begin with the much longer history of the Soviet Union's interaction with civil rights activism, which dates back all the way to the 1930s. So no, I won't be drawing a direct comparison between the miners and Davis, for example. And it is also, yes, and the literature notes that Davis is quite unique in her sort of membership of the Communist Party in the USA, when most of the Black Power movement are not, especially after 1972, they're no longer as interested in working with self-declared communists. So yes, no, there is definitely a critique definitely to be made, but yes, I won't be directly comparing them now.
I look forward to reading the finished product. It sounds fascinating.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Now we are still waiting for other comments from the audience. So I am checking the list. If you can see any raised hands, please let me know.
There's 2 raised hands in the audience.
Sorry?
There's 2 raised hands in the audience.
Where? Because I don't see them. Anna? Okay. Anna, please go ahead.
Yes, I have one question to James Brown as well. I wanted to ask you whether you know how Soviet officials or agencies established contacts to Angela Davis and via which channels?
Oh, I've already got my mic on. That's one of the things I'm looking at. I mean, unfortunately, with pandemic, not been able to get great archival access. So the main thing I've been looking at in terms of how they relate to the Angela Davis trial, I've started looking at the press to deal with that issue. How do they make this image, this sort of usable image for the Soviet press and the domestic consumption? But what I can say in terms of what I've seen, they do have visits between the Davis family and eventually Davis herself following the end of her trial. So there is direct communication between the two. But that's definitely something I'd like to know more about. Because they were very, very interested, not just in Davis, but the Soviets were interested in the wider Black Power movement, and there's KGB documents showing that they had full intentions to go through the Communist Party of the United States. That was their primary vehicle for engaging with the Black Power movement. So I think that would probably be the best place to start. But unfortunately, it's quite hard at the moment to find useful stuff. But so far, that's what I can concretely say. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and the other hand was Olga's, as far as I heard from my colleagues. So Olga, are you here? And yes, please ask your question.
Okay, dear presenters, I have a question to Christian and his presentation on the football diplomacy. I wanted to ask if there were any female football teams at the period that he had researched, and if there were any studies that Christian, sorry to address you in the third person. So it was just according to my that I was just developing a thought. Basically, I wanted to ask you if you, in your research, if you had happened to come across international diplomacy effort which was made from during the course of unification of Eastern and Western Germany, because as a person involved in digital media and storytelling, I had been covering this topic as well. However, exactly due to the fact that I haven't found any female football teams during that time in the this particular research area, I wanted to ask if perhaps, because you have advanced scientific, let's say, coverage of that topic, perhaps you could tell that you had seen that there were already some female football teams or some attempts. I view it as a very, very important topic on the global dimension, you see, because with my professional involvement, I come across many instances when female football or sports teams in the more male, let's say, culturally accepted sports could make substantial efforts into bringing democracy and, let's say, taking away autocracies and dictatorship and all these repressive political regimes. Thank you.
It is a terrific question. Unfortunately, I do not know enough about female during this time to be able to comment on that specifically. But what I can say is that I searched in the Hungarian case very specifically, very extensively through the archives, and was very thorough in my search. And in the Radio Free Europe archives and the CIA archives and the U.S. Foreign Service archives, I was not able to come across any documents which touched on female sports related to football, female football engagement during this time. Now, that does not mean that there wasn't, and I would have to plead my ignorance on that and pass that question on to someone else who's more familiar with it. But in terms of the archival research, I did not see any on that topic. And I focused mostly in my study on Hungary in the period 1950-1960. And so my understanding of the German case is much more limited, unfortunately.
Thank you. It's okay. That's great. Thank you.
Yes, let me come in here. Not that I'm a sports history expert, but from our memory, we can clearly state that there were no female football teams under the communist period up until the political changes in 1989. There were only male football teams. Of course, there was female sports in many other, like handball and many other fields, but not football. So that's something which we can confirm here. So any other questions? Because we have a little more time, but not very much, a few more minutes because we are behind schedule. But if there is any important question from the audience or from any of you.
I just have a quick question for the dissident.
Who is that? Who is speaking?
East Armstrong.
Oh, okay. I don't see you, but I can see your name and the hand. Okay, just go ahead.
Yeah, so on the dissidents in particular, like given that they were often manipulated by, say, Western governments or the governments where they came in, did they ever try to push back against this manipulation of their message and say that actually the message was something else and actually like actively push back against this? And also, was there ever any suspicion that they were like spies and anything in terms of espionage there, and how was that vetted for dissidents?
Well, in terms of the first question, yes, they regularly push back against. It's not so much that they are manipulated; it's their image, like you say, that's manipulated, and their views. And they do push back against this. Václav Havel, who's not a Soviet dissident, but he gives a really good example. He writes about how he really doesn't like the term dissident. He thinks, even that is far too much. Solzhenitsyn as well said something similar. And one of the most interesting things I found when looking, I went through Vladimir Bukovsky's archives, looking at how he eventually ended up working with the neoconservatives in America, and they've had this organization where it's basically just this anti-communist organization. They're trying to defeat the Soviet Union. It basically seems to be their goal. Very ambitious. But the interesting thing is when they work together, you can see them having all these disputes between, the neoconservatives and the dissidents. The neoconservatives are appalled that the dissidents, in this case Bukovsky, is supporting human rights activism in South Africa because the neoconservatives are not very keen on criticizing the South African government, and it sort of reveals that they're kind of ill-fitted for one another. So from a distance, the conservatives are able to manipulate this message quite well, but when they start working together, they realize that they quite often don't have all that much in common. So yes, they did definitely fight back on it. I didn't fully catch the second question. Sorry, could you repeat it?
Yeah. Was there ever any worry that these people might be spies or anything on that front?